Back when I was born, I didn't cry. And the doctor said, hey, let's hit him on the behind and see if he will react. He hit me, I reacted, and the rest is history. 28 years later, here I'm teaching you how to do React. So today I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's how to create a great component in React. This kind of differs than my usual React Hour content, but I have built 5 component libraries for 5 different companies through my career, and I just want to guide you through everything I've learned, how you can build great components, and how you can make them extensible, composable, and everything else. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So before we start, what's important to know is I'm going to be doing all of this in VS Code, and I'm going to be showing you all the things you need to do to build a great component. I won't be focusing on styling, but that will just be a part of it. And what I want to do in the end is build something that's really easy to use across your project. And it's really important for UI libraries, but it doesn't necessarily limited to UI libraries. So this will be useful for any kind of component. And all of these things are transferable, whatever you're building, even to like stuff like hooks and functions and stuff like that. So with that out of the way, let's start. So let's say you're trying to build a reusable button component and you want to make it usable across all the different scenarios you might have. And you might be wondering, how do I do it? So, well, the first thing obviously is to create the button component. So this component is going to return this. And I'm using Tailwind for styling, but this doesn't really matter. Right off the bat, this complains because it doesn't have the type. So the type is button. And let's say I want to take some props in. So when something happens, I want onClick to fire. And maybe I want the text for the button. So, and let's type it like this. So onClick, and I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna do text is string. All right, and sorry, here this should be void. So let's say I built my button like this, and then I do onClick from the props. And then instead of doing text like this, I want to do text. And instead of hard coding click me, I want to do text. All right, perfect. And here's my first button. And if I wanted to use it, let's say I wanted to do something like, I'm going to create a dummy component here. Let's call it page, and this is going to consume our button. So let's say return div, and then inside of that, we're going to do our button. And on click, our button clicked, and the text is clicking. So we technically got to the same point of abstraction as we had it when it was hard-coded, but there are a million issues with this component. First of all, let's say I wanted to use the underlying event, and I can't because I typed it as onClick that takes no event, and then it returns void, which is almost identical to one of the overloads of this function, but it doesn't support all the use cases. So if I want to use the native event of the button, I can't. And let's say I wanted to type this onClick. So what I need to do is import type mouse event, and then I'm gonna type this as mouse event HTML button element. All right, perfect. And now if I hover over this, it's unused. But if I do something like this, event.prevent default, it doesn't complain. You can see when you pass the onClick, it's the right event type, and this works great. Now, let's look at the text here. Now, the issue with this approach is that you're limiting yourself to a string. What I personally like to do is use React's built-in composability instead of using props. And what do I mean by that? So let's say you wanted to pass JSX here. So, and let's imagine you're doing this like half a year later. You need to go back to the button component to extend it to accept JSX here. So you would do something like text is either a string or JSX dot element. And then you would pass it into here, and then you could do something like text is div, and then something. And that would work. but you still had to go back and extend it. So what you can do is, instead of passing it as a prop, you would accept children here. So click me button, and now this closely resembles the original button element, so the HTML primitive, instead of using a prop. And why you would do this is because now instead of doing text, you do children, and you, instead of defining it like this, and then if you wanted to do a boolean, you would have to extend it again. You would just do react.react node, and this tells React that it has a node. You give it the children here, so whatever you render inside of here will work. So either if it's a boolean, if it's a string, if it's JSX, whatever, it's gonna work. This now closely resembles what you would have if you were just using the button element. And if I format this, now we have a little bit of a better component. But still, if you wanted to add a new functionality like change the type, you would still have to go back to the component. You would have to do type is then button or submit, for example. And let's say you don't know what the type of the button is, so you would pass in the type and you extract it from the props. And now the type is either button or submit. And now you don't really know about the third type that's reset. So you limit the functionality of your button primitive to not use that prop as well. So now at this point you might be thinking, okay, this is not really gonna work. Every time I have to add something new, I have to go back to the component, I have to change it, I have to do this and that. Well, this is where again React helps you. So instead of defining the button like this, what you can do is you can say component props, and that's a type from React, and you can either do component props or component props with ref. I think with ref is better be used in React 19, as forward ref is not a thing anymore, but component props works as well if you don't accept the reference. It depends on the component. For example, if you're doing a form component, you maybe don't want to accept a reference because you already overloaded. So I'm gonna do component props with ref here, and now in the generic here, I just tell it which component. So I need the button, and now I get the button. And as you can see, everything still works and it's typed correctly. So the onClick is typed correctly, the children is typed correctly, the type is typed correctly, and everything is typed correctly. And now, let's say you wanna add something else on the button. So for example, now this is in the component that uses it. You wanna do on blur. You see we get autocomplete, and we have all of these amazing properties that we can use because we used the type from React itself. We didn't narrow it down to like 3 or 4 props that we have to constantly keep expanding and expanding. We rely on React's primitives, or rather the HTML primitives that React just offers the types for, and then we build on top of that. And now our button accepts all props, but the issue is we don't pass it to the actual primitive here. So what we can do is we can spread the props like this. And when you spread the props as the last parameter here, this is basically telling the object, hey, take everything that's left in the props and give it to me as a props object. And then what you can do is you can spread that on the button element. And this should be done across all of your components. So for example, let's say you're doing input. So if you do input like this, again, what you would do is you would say component props with ref, and then you return it like this, and then you pass in the props. And you also spread them like this. And this way, whenever you use the input component, let's say I want to use the input here, I can do type is text, I can do placeholder, I can do whatever the native input element has. And this is how you build on top of the component. So first of all, you expand the primitive, and this doesn't really apply only to components. Let's say you wanted to build something like a sign up form. So this component is not really something that's primitive in HTML. I mean, the form is, but let's say it looks like this. And let's say you wanna allow the user to pass in anything he wants to the form. How we would do that is we would again do props is component props with ref, and then I'm gonna do form, and then I just spread the props here. And that's how you build great components. Now for a different scenario. Let's say the sign-up form takes all the form props that you want to pass, but you want to extend it in a way that it accepts some custom props. Let's say you want to have a custom on submit. Well, what you can do is you can do this and then give it additional properties. So for example, let's say our on submit. So because we already know that it's a sign-up form, maybe we don't take the primitive event, but because it's a sign-up form, you, for example, collect the email and the name, maybe we pass this as the argument. So user is email is string and password is a string, and then it returns void. So now that you accept this, what you can do is you can, for example, define an on submit here, and then you use the primitive event, you collect the values, so for example like this. And what this does is it creates a form data object from the current target, and because it's a form, it already has all the values. You get the email, you get the password, and then you give it to the props on submit. But as you can see, this is complaining, and it says on submit is specified more than once, so this usage will be overwritten. So what does this mean? Well, because we use the props to spread everything here, what's gonna happen is, because you have the on submit is gonna be defined here, and then spread again with props after this, so it's going to override this. So how do we fix this? Well, easy, we just move the props spreading over here. And this is another pattern that you're gonna use often. And I'm gonna go back to our button primitive, and we're gonna move all of this a little bit down. So let's say you want the user to still be able to manipulate the button, but you don't want him to override the custom logic you have in place. Let's say this. So let's say you have analytics, and it's some sort of like function, and this, let's imagine that this analytics, whenever you click a button, sends an analytics report to some backend API. But you still want to allow the user to pass the on-click event when this happens. So you would do something like this. You would define the on-click, you would first call the analytics, and then you would call the on-click that the user used. This is how you allow the user to call the on-click. But let's say you had this prop spreading in front of the on-click. Well, this works now. And the question is why? Well, that's because it's taken out of the props here. But if I do something like this, I delete it, and then I do props.onClick. Now this is going to override the onClick here. But this is not smart enough to figure it out in this case. So you really need to be very careful that when you're spreading props, you spread them before your custom logic. So for example, a really common use case is you want to have some custom class names, but you want to pass in additional class names later on. So how do you do that? Well, you make sure that the class name is after the prop spreading, and then inside of here, you make a string like this, so a template literal. And then what you can do is you can say props.className. And this now allows you to pass in any classes to the existing ones without any issues. And if I save this, it's gonna look like this. So as you can see, we first spread the props, and then you give it the type, you give it the class name, and you have the children, and it renders what you need it to render. So if I go over the button, it's still the same. And if I did something like class name, background is red 500, it would pass in the class name to the button. It would apply this class, and then it would override it with the props.className. Now, this is a very naive way of doing it. There's utility libraries that allow you to do class names easier, like CLSX or Tailwind Merge and stuff like that. That's out of the scope of this video, so I'm not gonna go over that. All right, so now we've built a great button component. So another thing you really need to know about is sensible defaults. So the reason I pluck out some of the properties here, because you maybe want to have defaults for them. So for example, every button in HTML, by default, if you don't specify the type, is of type submit. So that means if you put it in a form and you want it to just be some sort of button that does some random stuff, if you don't specify the type, it's going to submit the form. So how do you get over that? So what you do is you say the type is equal to button. So what this does, it tells the React component, hey, this is the default prop, but you can still override it. And then you pass it into here. And then what happens is, here I don't specify the type, but it's of type button. And if I wanted it to be of type submit, I would do type is equal to submit. And this is really great if you're building primitives, because that way you can define a bunch of stuff that's implicit in a way. That way you can override a lot of primitives in an easy way, and then let the user decide when they need some other things. So for example, the type here. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go to a different approach that I really think is important. And that is trying to make everything as optional as possible. So let's think of this scenario. Let's say you have a custom property called mask, or rather, let's not do it here. Let's do it in the input because that makes more sense. And let's say I have extended my input to accept a mask, and that's going to be a string. And then let's say that mask prop allows me to mask the input. So what that means is, let's say you have like a text field and you want to enter whatever you want. You can't. You have to enter, for example, a mask that's 5 numbers. So you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this would be your input. Well, you can do something like this. So you get the mask out of the props, or rather you get it directly here. And then what you can do is, well, the input kind of has this pattern property, which is kind of supposed to be a mask, but it isn't. But let's say you have your custom implementation. So let's say const, and I'm going to change this to be required. So const masked input is something like this. So value, and let's just follow whatever our Copilot pumps out. So this is our masked input. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to call props on change. And now, if you think about what I already told you, we don't want this to be overridden by the props. So we're going to pass it after, and we're going to do on change is equal to masked input. And because this accepts the React event, it's going to override the on change, and then you're going to call the on change once you do all of this logic. So now that you have this logic, the masked input is overriding the on change. But if I go to the bottom here, you can see that the input is complaining. So the reason behind this is because I made the mask required, whenever you use the input component, it's gonna require the mask type. So how you can get around this, you can say that the mask is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I don't want the mask to have to be passed in, because some inputs are just free inputs. So what I can do is I can go to the input, and then I can say that the mask can be undefined. So now it doesn't have to be defined. So there are 2 options you can do here. So if you're building something that really requires this new feature, the best way to add it in without breaking half of your app is defining a default value. So for example, let's say the mask is empty by default, and then you make all of this work. And the other way is you just expect undefined. So if not mask, you just return the props on change. Otherwise, you do all of this logic. So those are the 2 options you have. And that's how you handle adding new props in. And if I wanted to add something else in, I would still go here. I would say something else is equal to string. Again, now if I go back to our input, it complains that the property something else is missing. and then I can say something like something else is equal to string or whatever. This can be a number, this can be an object, it's up to you. So if you do that something else is required and you define the default here, it's still gonna ask you for something else. So if I go back here, it still asks me, hey, you didn't provide a property. So you have to make it optional anyways. So the best way to add new things in is make them optional and define a default if you need it. And the last bit I wanted to show you is, and I'm gonna do it with the input here. Let's imagine you have an input that can also have a button in it. Now the question is, how do you do that? Well, the best thing you can do is, there are two approaches. So either you use children if it works, but in this specific use case it doesn't, because the input, it doesn't make sense for input to have children. So what we're gonna do is, let's say you wanted to have a button. So now you might think, okay, let me do this. So component props with ref, and then component props with ref, and then I want to do button. So does this work? Well, no, it doesn't. And the reason behind it is because these props are now mixed between the button and the input component. And then how do you know which on click is supposed to be called for the button and which on click is supposed to be called for the input? Well, there's no way to know. So the easy way you can get around this and make your components really powerful is you can do something like this. So the button, and by default it's not required, as I said. And I think what I need to drive home more is you should try to make the properties optional as often as possible, because otherwise you would end up with components that require like 30 properties, and at that point, what's even the point of using them, because it's so cumbersome? Why not just use the native button? So check this out. So you can do component props with a ref button, and now if I don't have the button, what I can do is I can return the input as it is. But if I have the button, I can do something like this. So input props is the same as before, or I can even extract it to something like this. So const input primitive. So the input primitive is something like this. And then I can just return it like this. And then also here, the input primitive. And now I also have the button. So because we defined the props to have the button, now all of these props go into the button component. And then you render the children as well. And what you can do is you can also not pass the children in like this, but like this. Because this way it's still gonna take the children in and render it properly. So that's something that React does. It's not really something you have to define yourself. Because when you spread these props, it's going to end up having children, and then children is extracted and rendered here. So we're good in that. And now if I wanna use the button here, I would do button is equal to, and then type is, for example, submit. And then you have extended successfully your input component to have the button element. And this may be not useful for, well, defining the button on an input, but a very realistic use case is, let's say you have a label, and then we again define it like we did before. We return the label. So the label HTML primitive, and now this is complaining and says a form label must be associated with an input. So the cool thing is, so what we can do is we can say this. So name is required and it's gonna be a string, and we can extract the name, and we can say HTML4 is the name. Or what you can do is you can say HTML4 is a string. And then we can do HTML4 and make it a little bit more. And now you have the HTML4 defined. And now the label, you can say label, and then we can say component props label, and the HTML4 is this. But we don't really want to do the types like this. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna extract this type into its own label props. And then we say label props is this. And then we define it here. And now, if I wanted to do a label, I can do this. So label props, and then HTML4 is equal to props.name. So this is from the input. So whenever you define the name on the input, it's gonna be passed into HTML4. So now you have the label and the input linked together. And let's say you require the props name, or we're not gonna do it like this, but we're gonna make the name required. So name is required. And sometimes it makes sense to make some fields required, because the name should definitely be, in 99% of cases, defined in the input. So now this complains, but rightfully so. And I'm gonna do name is email. And now if I wanna pass in a label, I can. And I can do children is email, or I can pass in anything. So for example, let's say I wanna render something cool, div something cool. And now I just passed in the label prop. But you can see that it's complaining that the HTML4 is defined. So now what we do is we just go here, and because we already have the label props HTML4 defined inside the input component, we can say omit the HTML4. And now I have no idea why this is colored like this. But if I go to our input, as you can see, now it doesn't require the HTML4 anymore. And if I do HTML4, I can define it because it uses the name from the input. And this is how you build great components. You create primitives that rely on the HTML primitives. So if I go back to the top, you create the button that relies on the actual HTML button element. You allow the user to pass in all the props that are available on the button. You define sensible defaults. You make all the fields that are not required. You make some fields in the input element, for example, that are not required by default required because you want to have a name defined on the input. You allow the user to be and when I say the user, I always mean not the end user, but the developer who's using the component. You allow him to be very flexible by making everything undefined and optional and have default values. And then you get to a point where he can pass in a lot of stuff that's not required, but under the hood it does different things based on what's passed in. So for example, the masked input here, and now that I look at it, I forgot to do one click here and masked input. Oh, sorry, on change. And that's how you get to a point where you're building really great components. And for example, you can see that the input we just built is really cool. It accepts the label, it accepts the button, it accepts the input primitive, and now we can even add an error component. So for example, you do const error label, and again, you do this, and it's not, or actually let's not call it error label, let's call it error field. And then we can do, instead of label here, let's say P, and then again, return P props. Okay, this text is red. It gets the class names, it spreads the props, it renders children. And now we can do something like error is component props without ref, or even what we did before. So type, we extract the error field props into its own thing. And then we do error field props is this. The error prop here is error field props. And then inside of here, we say the error field accepts the props error, and then we don't need this class name, so let's remove it, for example. And you just built an input that accepts a label, that accepts the error field, that accepts the input primitive props, and that accepts the button. And now you have a super component that's in the end the same as the native input element, but you can extend it with different things. So the label, and then you can do the error here as well, and then something like this field is required. Or for example, let's say you have the error somewhere defined, so name error is equal to something, and then you could do something like this. So if the error is defined, then you pass it into the component as the children. Otherwise, you don't do anything. So if I save this, you end up with something like this. So you have the arrow, you have the label, you have the button, and this builds a really cool input component with the label, with the button, with the error text, and it all works out of the box. You compose all of these components together, and you get a really neat API, and in the end, if you just want an input, you just do this. And now you have an input. And if I save this, you just have an input that has the name, the type, and the placeholder. And that's how you build great components. And I know that this has been a little bit abstract, but I really like building components, and I hope you learned something today. If you did, let me know in the comments. If you have any questions or you have some other opinions, because this is really an opinionated thing, let me know. I think most of the stuff I covered is unopinionated and just good way to build components. And this is why I think that ShadCN is such a great component library, because this is a very similar approach they take. And if you take a look at their components, they're gonna make a lot more sense after watching all of this, because the approach is very similar. And that's it. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye!